When Big Shaq disguises as a mall security guard steps in to help a desperate family, he thinks it's just another night on the job. But when he uncovers a stolen file linked to a powerful corporation's darkest secret, things take a deadly turn. The men hunting the family aren't law enforcement, they're professionals, and they won't stop until the truth is erased. Using his security skills and tactical thinking, Shaq outmaneuvers them, ensuring the family escapes safely. But just as the danger seems over, a chilling realization hits him. This wasn't random. The men didn't just see him, they recognized him. His past, the one he thought he had outrun, is catching up fast, and this time, walking away might not be an option. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The glass doors of Westmont Plaza Mall slid open, letting in a wave of people escaping the crisp evening air. The mall was alive with the usual weekend crowd, teenagers laughing too loudly near the food court, couples strolling past luxury boutiques, and families hunting for discounts at department stores. Standing just outside storefront 27, positioned near a high-end watch retailer, Big Shaq scanned the passing faces, his presence imposing yet unassuming. He wasn't just a security guard. He was an observer. Dressed in a pressed navy blue uniform, a security badge clipped neatly to his chest, and an earpiece coiled behind his left ear, he looked the part. But something about him felt different. Unlike the other mall guards, he didn't chat aimlessly or linger at coffee kiosks. He stood with the kind of stillness that came from years of discipline, watching, waiting, measuring people's movements with an almost unnerving precision. Most shoppers paid him no attention. That was exactly how he liked it. Shaq wasn't here to make friends. He wasn't here to build a career. He was here to disappear. From his position near the store entrance, he could see everything that mattered. His eyes followed a man stuffing a perfume bottle into his coat pocket near a cosmetics stall, a group of college kids pushing each other too aggressively near the escalator. A woman, her hands trembling slightly, fumbling through her purse as if debating whether to shop or flee. Shaq had seen it all before. People stealing, people lying, people hiding things. That's why when the family walked in, he noticed immediately. A man, a woman, and a little girl. They looked normal enough, but to Shaq, something was off. The mother, clutching a large tote bag, kept glancing over her shoulder, her expression tight. The father walked too close to her, too protective. His hand firmly placed on his daughter's shoulder, steering her through the crowd like she might vanish at any moment. And the little girl? She wasn't like the other kids running toward the toy store or begging for candy. She was silent, too still. Her fingers clutched the hem of her father's coat, and her eyes flickered across the mall, not with excitement, but with fear. Shaq had spent years reading people. This family, they weren't shopping. They were running. Shaq's radio crackled. Unit 4, check on the North Wing entrance. Possible disturbance near electronics. Standard mall security protocol. The kind of thing he was supposed to focus on. But he didn't move. Instead, he watched as the family made a sharp turn toward the elevators, bypassing the central seating area. The father's grip on his daughter's shoulder tightened ever so slightly. Shaq's gut tightened. Something wasn't right. Ignoring the radio, he stepped away from his post, moving into the crowd, staying in their blind spot. Years of instinct told him, if you don't want to be seen, move like you belong. He followed from a distance, never too close, never obvious. And then, the mother turned. Her eyes flicked toward him, just for a split second. Shaq saw it all in that look. Fear, desperation, a silent plea. And then, she did something unexpected. She dropped something, a small crumpled receipt. A normal person might think it was accidental, but Shaq knew better. His footsteps slowed as he approached the discarded slip of paper on the glossy mall floor. Carefully, without drawing attention, he crouched slightly, pretending to adjust his boot. Then, he picked it up, and what he saw made his stomach knot. Written in hurried, uneven handwriting, in what looked like smudged eyeliner, were 3 words. They're watching us. Shaq didn't blink, didn't react. He just slid the paper into his pocket and kept walking. He knew before even looking who they were. His eyes shifted subtly across the mall, and then he saw them. Two men, dressed in dark suits, standing near the high-end jewelry store, blending in but not quite right. They weren't shopping. They weren't mall security. They were waiting, watching, tracking. Shaq had seen men like them before. They weren't here to shop. They were here for the family. Shaq was not a hero. He had left that part of his life behind. He had no reason to get involved. People had problems every day. People ran from things all the time. This wasn't his fight. And yet, as he watched the mother's hands tremble, as he saw the father clenching his jaw, as he noticed the silent terror in the little girl's eyes, his gut told him otherwise. He took a slow, steady breath. And then, he made a choice. He wasn't going to walk away. Not yet. Not when he was the only one who saw what was coming. Shaq moved back to his post, appearing casual, but his mind was already working. Where would the family go next? Where would they make their move? He needed to be ahead of it. His fingers brushed against the radio at his hip. Technically, he could call it in, get the mall security team involved. But something told him that was a mistake. If these men were who he thought they were, they'd have already paid off mall security. This wasn't about calling for help. This was about being smarter. He adjusted his coat, his stance still relaxed. But his eyes never left the family. And as the mother looked back one last time, her face pale, he gave her the smallest nod. A silent message. I see you. I understand. I'm here. And for the first time, she breathed. Shaq stood near the watch store, his fingers lightly tapping against the side of his belt, his posture relaxed but his mind racing. The note in his pocket felt heavier than it should have been, its meaning pressing against his chest like a weight he wasn't sure he wanted to carry. They're watching us. Please help. He had read it twice, but the urgency in the scrawled letters had already burned itself into his mind. He hadn't planned to get involved. He had trained himself not to. His job was simple: observe, report, maintain order. That was it. That was all that was expected of him, but his instincts were already pulling him in another direction. He glanced back toward the family. The mother gripped her daughter's hand a little too tightly. The father kept adjusting his collar, shifting his weight uncomfortably, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to go wrong at any moment. And then there were the two men. Shaq had seen them the second they entered his line of sight. They weren't ordinary shoppers. Their suits were too crisp, their movements too controlled. They weren't browsing. They weren't waiting for anyone. They were tracking. Their eyes barely left the family, their expressions blank, detached, professional. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. Shaq exhaled slowly, his breath steady, controlled. This was the part where he made a choice. Step in or walk away. Every bit of logic told him to leave it alone. He didn't know these people. He had no idea what they were involved in. If he stepped in now, there was no telling how deep he'd get pulled in. But the problem was, he had already stepped in. The moment the mother dropped that note, she had made him a part of this, whether he liked it or not. His eyes shifted to the two men again. They hadn't moved, but something in their stance had changed. One of them subtly adjusted his tie, a quick motion that might have seemed like nothing to most people. But to Shaq, it was a signal, a silent command. It was about to happen. Whatever it was. The mother knew it too. She leaned toward her husband, whispering something so softly that even Shaq couldn't read her lips. The father nodded once, his jaw tight. Then, as if on cue, he took his daughter's hand and turned toward the department store entrance. Casual, slow, like they were just another family going shopping. But Shaq saw the tension in their shoulders, the stiffness in their movements. This was not a casual decision. This was an escape route. The two men began moving as well. They didn't rush. They didn't push through the crowd. They walked with purpose, a slow, steady pursuit that said one thing: we don't need to run. You're not getting away. Shaq's fingers twitched at his side. He was running out of time to decide. His past told him to stay out of it. His instincts refused to let him ignore it. He stepped away from his post, blending into the moving crowd. His height and size made him noticeable, but he had learned how to disappear in plain sight. Move with the people, keep his pace natural. He stayed far enough back that neither the family nor the men tailing them would notice him, but close enough that if something happened, he'd be there before it got worse. The family entered the department store, slipping between clothing racks and maneuvering past displays of handbags and perfume counters. The mother kept glancing over her shoulder. The father pretended to be interested in a watch display, but his fingers drummed anxiously against the glass. Shaq turned his attention to the two men. They were good. They didn't follow the family directly. They took separate routes, one circling the shoe section, the other browsing near the escalators. From an outsider's perspective, they looked like nothing more than two businessmen taking their time in a store. But Shaq wasn't an outsider. He had seen men like them before. They weren't here to shop. The family was running out of space. The mother nudged her daughter toward a nearby dressing room area, probably hoping for a moment of cover. But Shaq could already tell it wouldn't be enough. The department store had only one main exit, and both men were positioned in a way that would cut them off completely if they tried to leave. It was a trap. The father seemed to realize it at the same time Shaq did. His hand clenched into a fist, his shoulders tightening. He was getting ready to do something reckless. Shaq had seen that look before. It was the look of a man about to make a move he wasn't prepared for, the kind of move that would end badly. Shaq moved first. Stepping casually toward the watch counter, he positioned himself between one of the suited men and the exit. He didn't make eye contact, didn't draw attention to himself. But he was there now, a new obstacle in their path. The man nearest to him hesitated for half a second. That was all Shaq needed. A brief pause in their rhythm, a minor disruption in their plan. It wouldn't stop them, but it would slow them down. Shaq's earpiece crackled. Unit 4, status check. You haven't reported in. His jaw tightened. This wasn't the time. Still patrolling, he muttered under his breath, barely moving his lips. Copy that. The line went dead. Shaq exhaled slowly. Focus. The father had seen him now. Their eyes met just for a moment. Shaq didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The father understood. Shaq was giving them a chance, a window, a way out. The mother whispered something to her daughter. The little girl nodded, gripping her mother's hand tighter. Then, they moved. Not fast. Not recklessly. But with purpose. They slipped behind a display rack, using it as cover, then maneuvered toward the back of the store where a secondary employee exit was located. Shaq turned his head slightly, just enough to see how the two men would react. One of them, the taller one, the leader, noticed the change in movement. His brow furrowed. He knew something was off. Then he spotted Shaq. And for the first time, their eyes met. Cold. Calculating. A flicker of recognition. Like the man was trying to place him. Shaq didn't move. Didn't blink. He just held the stare. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. But it was enough. By the time the man turned his attention back to the family, they were gone. Shaq stayed where he was, watching as the two men reevaluated. The shorter one said something under his breath, clearly frustrated. The taller one simply exhaled through his nose, adjusting his tie like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Then, without another word, they left. No scene, no shouting, just a quiet, methodical retreat. But Shaq knew what that meant. This wasn't over. They weren't giving up. They were just adjusting their strategy. Which meant Shaq had just made himself part of the problem. He wasn't just a security guard anymore. Now they would be watching him too. And somehow, he had the feeling this was only the beginning. The air inside Westmont Plaza Mall had shifted. To most shoppers, everything still seemed normal. The music played softly from overhead speakers, cash registers beeped in steady rhythms, and sales associates folded clothes with practiced efficiency. But for those who knew how to read between the lines, something had changed. Shaq could feel it. The chase hadn't ended when the family slipped out of sight. It had only moved to its next phase. From his position near the escalators, Shaq tracked the father's movements. The man had slowed his pace, positioning himself in front of the department store entrance while his wife and daughter disappeared inside. He was stalling, trying to buy time. Shaq's instincts sharpened. The mother had panicked, but the father was still playing a role. The way he casually checked his watch, the forced ease in his body language, he was pretending that he wasn't aware of the two men following them. But Shaq could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his fingers. This man was not a professional. He was in way over his head. And the two men in suits? They knew it. The taller of the two men approached first. His steps were slow, deliberate. He adjusted his cuffs as he moved, his expression unreadable. His partner, the shorter and stockier one, followed closely, positioning himself to block any attempt at retreat. Shaq watched closely, studying their tactics. They weren't rushing. They weren't grabbing him. No, they were toying with him. This wasn't brute force. This was intimidation. The father, still playing the part, offered a polite smile. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. "Can I help you?" The taller man returned the smile, though his was colder, sharper. "We were hoping to ask you a few questions." The father let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "I'm in the middle of some shopping with my family. Maybe another time?" The shorter man tilted his head, his hands sliding into his pockets. "It's important. Shouldn't take long." Shaq narrowed his eyes. It was subtle, but he caught it. The father's weight shifted ever so slightly to his back foot. An unconscious movement. A preparation to run. The taller man must have noticed it too, because that was the moment he reached into his coat and pulled out a badge. "Let's not make this difficult," the man said. The father hesitated. His breathing hitched for just a fraction of a second. But Shaq? He saw through it immediately. Shaq had seen enough real law enforcement to recognize the tells of a fake. For starters, the man didn't announce his agency. If you're flashing a badge in public, you say who you're with. FBI, Homeland Security, even local detectives, real agents always identify themselves. These men didn't, because they couldn't. Second, the badge itself. It looked too clean, too polished. A real badge gets worn, subtle scratches, minor imperfections. But this one? It looked fresh out of a printer. Shaq's grip tightened at his sides. These men weren't cops. They were something else. And the father? He had figured it out too. The father forced an easy chuckle, shaking his head. "I think you've got the wrong guy." The taller man didn't move. His eyes stayed locked onto him, assessing. The shorter man leaned in slightly. "We wouldn't want to cause a scene in front of your wife and daughter. Maybe we go somewhere private?" The father's fake smile barely held. "Like I said, you've got the wrong guy." There was a long, stretched silence. Shaq watched as the taller man finally exhaled, as if reluctantly giving up. He tucked the fake badge back into his pocket, tilting his head slightly. "If that's the case, enjoy your evening." The father hesitated just half a second too long before nodding. "You too." Then, carefully, he turned and walked away. Shaq's eyes flicked back to the two men. They weren't watching the father anymore. They were watching the department store entrance. They knew. The father had bought seconds, not safety. And that meant Shaq had a decision to make. The father disappeared into the department store, probably heading straight for his wife and daughter. The two men didn't follow immediately. That told Shaq everything he needed to know. They weren't worried about losing him, because they already knew where the family was going next. And they weren't wrong. There was only one place to go from here. The parking garage. Shaq adjusted his stance, shifting his weight onto his heels as he subtly scanned the nearest exits. If the family had parked somewhere inside the garage, it meant they were walking straight into a controlled environment. No cameras, no crowds, no escape. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had hoped the father was smarter than this. Apparently not. By the time Shaq stepped out onto the parking structure's concrete floor, the air had changed again. The artificial lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering every so often, casting strange shadows against the walls. The scent of oil and exhaust lingered in the air, thick and heavy. And there, near the far end of the garage, the family. The mother stood near the passenger side of a black SUV, her daughter partially hidden behind her leg. The father stood near the front, digging through his pockets, probably pretending to look for the keys. But Shaq could see what was really happening. The father wasn't stalling for his keys, he was stalling because he already knew they weren't alone. The two men stepped out from the shadows near the garage entrance, their footsteps measured, unrushed. The family was trapped. Shaq moved quickly, slipping between two parked cars, closing the distance. The father noticed first. His expression flickered with something. Relief? Recognition? Shaq wasn't sure. The taller man didn't even glance at him. His focus was on the father. "You made this harder than it needed to be," the man said, voice level. The father tensed. Shaq noted everything. The mother's tight grip on her daughter, the way the shorter man stood slightly behind, blocking the way out. The father's hands clenched just slightly into fists. No one moved. The moment stretched longer and longer. Shaq took a slow step forward. "Evening, gentlemen." That was the first time the shorter man looked at him. His expression barely shifted. Like he had expected Shaq to be there, like this was just another complication to adjust for. The mother looked at Shaq, her eyes wide. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Shaq understood. She was begging him not to leave. And Shaq? He wasn't going anywhere. The taller man finally looked at Shaq, his head tilting slightly. He studied him like he was an unfamiliar variable in an equation that had been carefully calculated. Then, he smiled. Not a real smile, a warning. "You should probably head back inside, officer," he said. "Mall security doesn't have jurisdiction out here." Shaq didn't move. "You're right, but I'm off the clock." Another silence. Then, the man let out a quiet chuckle. "That's unfortunate." For a split second, everything held still. Then, the father reached for the car door. The shorter man shifted slightly. The mother gripped her daughter tighter, and Shaq knew. The trap had closed, and now? It was time to break it. But how? Shaq moved carefully, his heavy boots making barely a sound against the cold concrete of the Westmont Plaza parking garage. The air was thick with exhaust fumes, the dim fluorescent lights overhead flickering every few seconds, casting eerie shadows against the parked cars. The enclosed space felt wrong. Too quiet. Too controlled. Then he saw them. The two men stood like statues, one near the front of the family's black SUV, the other by the driver's side, effectively blocking any escape route. Their postures were too casual, their hands resting near their pockets, a silent message that they were in control. The mother clutched her daughter tightly, her back pressed against the SUV, shielding the little girl. Her knuckles had turned white around the fabric of the child's jacket. The father stood between them and the men, his hands up in a forced attempt at calm. His stance was protective, but Shaq could tell he was out of his depth. This wasn't just a random shakedown. This was a negotiation. The taller of the two men, the one who had flashed the fake badge earlier, took a step forward. His face remained blank, unreadable. His tone was even, almost polite. "You know why we're here." The father shook his head. "I don't." A slow smile. "Come on. Let's not waste time." The father swallowed hard, his entire body stiff. "I don't have what you're looking for." The shorter man let out a small sigh, like he had been expecting this response. He tapped his fingers against the SUV's hood, the soft metallic clicks filling the silence. "I don't think that's true." Shaq's eyes flicked to the mother. Her lips were slightly parted, her breath shallow. Her gaze was locked on her husband, as if willing him not to make a mistake. The little girl, too young to understand everything, was frozen, her small hands clutching the hem of her mother's coat. Fear was radiating off them. Whatever these men wanted, it was something worth running for. The father took a small step back. A crack appeared in his carefully controlled expression. "Please," he said, his voice lower now. "I have my daughter here. We don't want trouble." The taller man tilted his head, feigning sympathy. "Then let's make it easy. You give us what we need and we all walk away like this never happened." The father hesitated. The shorter man's tone hardened. "You know how this works? We're not leaving without it." Shaq's gut tightened. It was clear now, this was bigger than a simple threat. The father had something valuable, and these men were under strict orders to retrieve it. Shaq's mind raced. What could be worth all this? Money, a hard drive, documents? Whatever it wasn't small enough for them to risk grabbing and running. They needed the father to give it up voluntarily, which meant they weren't just hired muscle, they were agents of something bigger, and Shaq had seconds to decide what to do. Intervening the wrong way could make things worse. If he charged in, it could force the situation into panic mode, and these men would react unpredictably. The family could get caught in the middle. Shaq needed to be smart. He scanned the garage, mentally mapping the space. He knew the mall's security system inside and out, where the cameras were, which areas had sensor-triggered alarms, and most importantly, how to manipulate them. His mind locked onto a plan. Shaq took a few quiet steps toward the nearest parking garage emergency panel, just behind a concrete pillar. His fingers moved swiftly, unhooking the radio clipped to his belt. He wasn't calling for backup, he was hacking the system. With a subtle flick of his wrist, he pressed a silent security override, one that wouldn't immediately sound alarms, but would make the system think a threat was detected. And then, he activated the breach protocol. A few feet away, the entire lighting system flickered aggressively. The sudden blinding flashes bounced off the windshields of parked cars, creating an almost strobe-like effect. A loud metallic screech echoed as the mall's automated security gates began to lower at the entrance. The shorter man turned sharply, startled. "What the hell?" Then the overhead security intercom crackled to life. "Security breach detected. Emergency lockdown in progress." It was exactly the disruption Shaq needed. The father reacted fast, grabbing his wife's hand. "Get in the car." The taller man cursed under his breath, his carefully controlled demeanor cracking as he turned toward his partner. Shaq stepped out from behind the pillar, making his presence known for the first time. His voice was calm but firm. "Problem, gentlemen?" The shorter man's head snapped toward him, his face twisting with recognition. Shaq had seen that look before. This wasn't the first time these men had dealt with someone like him. They weren't surprised by his presence, they were annoyed by it. The taller man let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. "This isn't your concern, officer." Shaq held his ground. "It is if you're disturbing guests, and from where I'm standing, that's exactly what you're doing." The father had already slipped into the driver's seat. The mother was pulling their daughter inside. But the two men weren't leaving yet. The shorter one took a small step forward, his voice lower now. "This doesn't have to get complicated." Shaq met his gaze evenly. "It already is." A few seconds of tense silence stretched between them. Then, sirens blared outside. Security officers were moving toward the garage. They weren't coming for Shaq, and they weren't coming for the family. But the optics were bad now. The two men knew they had lost their window. Shaq could see it in their eyes. The taller one exhaled through his nose, glancing at his partner. Then, without another word, they turned and walked away. Not defeated, just retreating. The security gates stopped lowering, the system catching up with Shaq's override. The lights returned to normal, the false lockdown clearing. The black SUV was already reversing out of its space, tires screeching slightly as the father pulled onto the main exit lane. Shaq didn't turn to watch them go. He kept his focus on the two men, memorizing every detail. As they reached the far end of the garage, the shorter man turned back one last time. His stare was different now. Not frustration, not defeat, but interest. Like he was studying Shaq the same way Shaq had studied him. Then he gave the faintest nod as if saying, "All right, big guy. You want in? Let's see how far you go." Then they were gone. Shaq finally exhaled. The family had gotten away, for now. But the two men hadn't left in a hurry. They hadn't called for backup, which meant they didn't see this as a failure. They saw it as an adjustment. And now, they weren't just tracking the family. They were tracking him too. Walls. The maintenance hallway smelled of industrial cleaner and damp concrete, a stark contrast to the glossy floors and designer storefronts of Westmont Plaza. It was quiet back here. Too quiet. The only sound was the sharp, panting breaths of the family as they pressed themselves against the wall, their backs rigid with fear. The mother clutched her daughter so tightly it looked like she might never let go. The father stood slightly ahead of them, his hands on his knees, trying to regain his breath after their frantic escape. And then there was Shaq, standing just a few feet away, his large frame blocking the only entrance to the hallway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He had followed them here, given them space, given them safety. But now he wanted answers, and he wanted them now. Shaq let the silence linger just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, in a voice steady and low, he spoke. "Start talking." The father wiped the sweat from his brow, exchanging a hesitant glance with his wife. He didn't want to do this. It was written all over his face. But at this point, there was no choice. "My name is Eric," he began, his voice hoarse. "This is my wife, Dana, and our daughter, Lila." Shaq didn't react. Names didn't matter right now. "I used to work for a company called Syntrex Labs." That got Shaq's attention. He didn't move, didn't blink, but a faint flicker of recognition passed through his mind. Syntrex, he'd heard of them. Big company, medical research, government contracts. But if this was about corporate espionage, it wouldn't explain the level of fear in their eyes. Eric took a deep breath, bracing himself for the next part. "Syntrex isn't just a pharmaceutical company, it's..." He hesitated, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It's a cover." Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly. Dana tightened her grip on Lila, swallowing hard. "They're experimenting on people," she whispered. That made Shaq pause. Experimenting. Not just corruption. Not just illegal business dealings. Something much worse. Eric continued, his voice lower now as if he half expected someone to be listening. "I worked in data management. I wasn't some high-level scientist. I just handled classified files, made sure everything was scrubbed and untraceable." He exhaled sharply. "At least that's what I thought I was doing." Shaq said nothing, letting him talk. "One day a file crossed my desk. A project I wasn't supposed to see." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. It was about clinical trials, but not on volunteers. People were being taken, off the streets, out of hospitals. No records, no history, just gone. Shaq's stomach twisted, but his face remained impassive. Eric's voice wavered. "The reports showed genetic modifications, neural testing. Things that shouldn't be possible, things that shouldn't be legal." Dana closed her eyes, as if she couldn't bear to hear it again. "I copied the files." Eric clenched his fists. "I didn't think. I knew I couldn't ignore it." Shaq finally spoke. "Where are they now?" Eric hesitated. His lips parted like he wanted to lie, but he had to know there was no point. "They're here," he admitted. Shaq's expression didn't change, but inside something clicked. That's why these men were after them. The stolen files weren't digital. They weren't hidden in a cloud. They were physically inside this mall. And now, so were the people hunting for them. "The two men following us?" Dana spoke this time, her voice trembling. "They're not government agents." Shaq already knew that. "They work for Syntrex," Eric confirmed. "The company has its own private task force. They handle problems that can't go through legal channels." Shaq's mind worked through the puzzle. If these men were hired retrieval specialists, they wouldn't leave until they got what they came for. They had let the family slip away, but they weren't gone. They were watching, waiting, adjusting. And now that Shaq had gotten involved, he was part of the problem too. Eric ran a hand over his face, exhaustion setting in. "We need to get those files before they do. If we don't, They'll erase everything. Dana's grip on her daughter tightened. "We just want to disappear," she said, pleading now. "Get the files, get out. Make sure they can't find us again." Shaq studied them, weighing everything. He should walk away. It wasn't his fight. He had done enough, helped them escape the first time. He had no reason to stay in this any longer. And yet, his mind flashed back to the way those men looked at him. They wouldn't stop at this family. They wouldn't stop at retrieving the files. If Syntrex had been operating in the shadows for this long, they had systems in place to keep people silent. Which meant, if he let them win tonight, they'd do this again. And again. He could leave. Or he could make sure this was the last time. Shaq rolled his shoulders, exhaling slowly. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, firm. "We're in the mall." Eric blinked. "What?" "The files," Shaq said, meeting his eyes. "Where are they?" Dana's breath caught. Lila clung to her mother, her wide eyes filled with hope. Eric hesitated for only a second before answering. "There's a storage room in the west wing," he said quickly. "I hid the files in a ventilation duct." Shaq nodded once. "All right," he said. "Here's what we're going to do." The energy in the room shifted. A few minutes ago, they were a family running for their lives. Now, they had something else. A plan. And Shaq? He was all in. The maintenance hallway was silent except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting eerie shadows on the cold industrial walls. The air smelled of stale mop water and metallic dust, the forgotten corners of a place meant for customers, but built for people like Shaq. He had spent months learning every inch of this mall, knowing which cameras had blind spots, which doors were alarmed but never properly checked, which hallways led to nowhere. Now that knowledge was about to be tested. Eric and Dana stood nearby, their bodies still tense, their breath unsteady. Lila clung to her mother's coat, her small fingers gripping the fabric as if letting go would make them disappear. They were waiting for a plan. Shaq exhaled slowly. He didn't do plans. He did instinct. But right now, he needed both. "We need to get to the west wing," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant chatter of shoppers outside the hidden corridor. "The storage room where I hid the files, it's in a restricted area near the old security office." Shaq nodded. He already knew the place. That section of the mall had been under renovation for months, making it the perfect spot to stash something that wasn't meant to be found. But there was a problem. "They're already looking for you," Shaq said, voice calm but firm. "You think those guys just left? No chance." Dana swallowed hard. "You think they're still here?" Shaq turned toward the small security monitor mounted in the corner of the hallway. It wasn't part of the main system, just a backup feed for maintenance workers. He tapped a few buttons on the outdated control panel, and the screen flickered. Then, there they were. The two men, walking casually through the central atrium of the mall, their expressions unreadable, their pace unhurried. They weren't panicking, because they didn't think they needed to. Shaq studied the way they moved. No wasted steps, no nervous glances. They knew exactly where to go. "They don't have the files," he said, more to himself than to the family. "But they know they're still in the mall." Eric wiped his palms against his jeans. "So what do we do?" Shaq turned toward him, his voice steady. "We don't run. We make them." Shaq stepped out of the maintenance hallway first, scanning the area before motioning the family forward. They moved quickly but not recklessly, slipping through the employee corridors and avoiding main walkways where cameras were in full view. Shaq kept his pace even, never letting them fall behind. He could feel the tension rising. Every turn felt like an opening for disaster. Every echo of footsteps behind them felt too close. By the time they reached the West Wing, the mall had thinned out. The high-end stores in this section had already closed for the night, their security gates pulled down, their window displays bathed in dim after-hours lighting. "Storage room is down that hallway," Eric whispered, pointing to a door marked Authorized Personnel Only. Shaq tested the handle. Locked. But that wasn't a problem. He pulled out his security override card, a small piece of plastic that told the system he was someone who belonged here. A soft beep. The lock released. He pushed the door open, ushering the family inside before stepping in after them. The storage room was exactly what Shaq expected. Rows of shelving units stacked with old mall signage, unused security monitors, and boxes filled with forgotten paperwork. Eric moved fast, reaching toward the ventilation grate at the far end of the room. His fingers trembled slightly as he pried it open, his breath shallow as he pulled out a small black USB drive wrapped in a plastic bag. "This is it," he whispered, gripping it so tightly his knuckles went white. Dana let out a shaky breath of relief. Shaq didn't feel relieved at all, because something still felt wrong. And then, the overhead intercom system crackled. A deep voice echoed through the speakers. "Attention, shoppers. The mall will be closing in 20 minutes. Please proceed to the nearest exits." Shaq froze. Not because of the message, but because of the voice. It wasn't the mall's automated system. It was one of them. They had hijacked the PA. And if they could do that, they weren't just tracking the family anymore. They were tracking him. Shaq moved fast. "We need to flip this," he said, already pulling his security radio from his belt. Eric looked confused. "Flip what?" Shaq pressed a button on his radio, accessing the surveillance override system. And suddenly, the mall's security monitors weren't showing random shoppers anymore. They were showing the two men, clear as day, walking, scanning, searching. "I just put them on every active monitor in the building," Shaq said. "Anyone who looks up at a security screen is seeing them." Eric blinked. "So now everyone knows they're here?" Shaq nodded. "And now they have a problem." In the mall's security office, two junior guards watched in confusion as the monitors flickered, switching feeds rapidly before locking onto two unknown men. "What the hell?" one of them muttered. "Who are these guys?" the other asked. A few feet away, the mall's head of security, a gruff, heavy-set man named Lewis, leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "That's not our system doing that," he muttered. One of the junior guards grabbed his radio. "Should we?" "Yeah," Lewis cut him off. "We should." Within seconds, every remaining security officer in the mall was looking for two men in suits. The taller man stopped walking as he noticed something had shifted. People were looking at him differently, not the usual passive glances of casual shoppers. These were pointed stares, and then he saw it. Himself. Reflected in a security monitor mounted in a store window. Every screen around the mall was broadcasting their exact location. His jaw tightened. They weren't tracking anyone anymore. They were being tracked. And then came the final hit. The PA system crackled again. This time, Shaq's voice filled the air. "If you're looking for two guys in suits," he said, his tone almost amused, "we found them." The message wasn't for shoppers. It was for security. The shorter man exhaled sharply. "We need to go, now." The taller man's eyes remained locked on the security monitor, and for the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Shaq watched from the shadows of the West Wing, his arms crossed as he saw the two men slowly realize they had lost control. They didn't make a scene. They didn't run. They did what professionals do when a mission goes sideways. They retreated. Shaq watched them disappear toward a back exit, blending into the thinning crowd. Eric let out a breath. "Is that it? They're gone?" Shaq shook his head. "No," he said simply. "They're just regrouping." Dana squeezed Lila's hand. "So what do we do now?" Shaq finally turned to them. "You leave." Eric hesitated. "And you?" Shaq rolled his shoulders, exhaling slowly. "They know my name now," he said, "so I might as well know theirs." The family slipped out through a side exit, disappearing into the city beyond. Shaq remained where he was, watching the empty mall corridors, listening to the distant sound of security chatter. Tonight wasn't the end. It was just the start of a much bigger game. And Shaq? He was ready to play. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city beyond the Westmont Plaza Mall. In the empty parking lot, a black SUV sat idling, its taillights glowing red against the damp pavement. Inside, Eric, Dana, and Lila were safe, for now. Shaq stood a few feet away, his hands resting loosely at his sides. His presence was still, but his mind wasn't. The weight of the night sat heavy on his shoulders. He had done what needed to be done. The family had escaped. The men in suits had been forced to retreat, but something about it felt unfinished. Eric leaned out of the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him steady. His eyes met Shaq's, a silent exchange. Gratitude, relief, and something else. A lingering fear that even now, even after everything, this wasn't really over. Dana turned in her seat, looking at Shaq through the open window. Lila was curled up in the back seat, her small hands wrapped around her mother's arm, half asleep. "I don't know how to thank you," Dana said, her voice raw with exhaustion. Shaq didn't respond right away. He didn't do gratitude, didn't need it. He just nodded. "You good to drive?" Eric nodded quickly. Yeah, we're good." Shaq studied him for a second longer, making sure. The man looked shaken but steady. "Then go," Shaq said. Eric hesitated. "You sure about this?" Shaq glanced over his shoulder, scanning the shadows between the cars, the mall's empty entrance, the distant glow of streetlights. He was sure. Even if he wasn't, there was no going back now. Eric didn't argue. The engine rumbled as the SUV pulled away, tires rolling smoothly onto the main road. Within seconds, they were just another set of taillights disappearing into the night. Shaq watched them go, his expression unreadable. They were safe. Or at least as safe as they could be. But safety was a temporary thing. He knew that better than anyone. A few blocks away, in an empty lot behind an abandoned warehouse, Eric parked the SUV and stepped out. His hands were shaking as he pulled the small black USB drive from his pocket. Dana watched from the passenger seat, her heart hammering. "Are you sure?" Eric nodded. More sure than he'd ever been about anything. He had risked everything for these files. Had stolen them, hidden them, nearly died for them. But he finally understood. As long as they existed, his family would never be safe. He placed the USB on the ground, took a step back. Then, with a sharp inhale, he brought his boot down hard. The crunch of plastic and metal echoed in the empty lot. Dana closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. It was done. No files, no proof. Nothing left to hunt them for. Lila stirred in the back seat but didn't wake. Eric climbed back into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel. "We start over," he said softly. Dana reached over, placing a hand over his. "We already did." They pulled away, disappearing into the city, leaving behind the shattered remains of a secret that was never meant to be exposed. Back at the mall, Shaq remained in the parking lot, his gaze locked on the empty space where the SUV had been. Something wasn't sitting right. He ran through the night's events in his head, every detail, every interaction. Then, the moment hit him. A split-second memory. One of the men in suits watching him, not just assessing, recognizing. Shaq had assumed this was about the family, about the stolen files, about tying up loose ends. But what if it wasn't? What if it had never been about the files at all? His breath slowed, his pulse stayed steady. He had been careful for years, kept his head down. His past, the one he thought he had outrun, was finally catching up. Shaq let out a slow breath, turning toward the mall one last time. The security lights buzzed overhead, casting his shadow long across the pavement. A few feet away, a security patrol car idled near the entrance, 2 guards stepping out, scanning the lot. They weren't looking for him. Not yet. Shaq adjusted his jacket, slipping his hands into his pockets. His shoulders relaxed, his posture easy. Then, without another word, he walked away. Not toward the lights, not toward the city, but into the shadows. Because whatever was coming next, he'd be ready. Shaq thought he left his past behind, But some secrets don't stay buried. The family may be safe, but the people hunting them aren't done. And now they're after him. Who are they? What do they know about Shaq that he doesn't? And most importantly, what happens when they come back? This was just the beginning of a much bigger game, and Shaq is about to find out he's been a part of it all along. Don't miss what comes next. Stay tuned for the next chapter in Shaq's fight for the truth.